I am Krista Tippett, and I was so delighted and honored by this invitation when it came in, because I have found myself turning to biblical and theological language as never before in recent months in my reckoning with public life as the only language and sensibility that is big enough to meet this time we're in, and to ponder what I am called to, what we're called to as communities, as a nation, I think as a species. I have been using the language of confession and repentance, lamentation, and a turn to what is redemptive. I've been thinking about how in the New Testament Greek, the meaning of apocalypse is not the cataclysm to end all cataclysms. The meaning of apocalypse is an uncovering. And that is such an apt description of this moment we inhabit. So much is being laid bare about the work that is upon us. And this work is close and intimate in each of our lives. And it is civilizational, and it is cosmic and sacred. And the high holy days hold that knowledge and invite us into it. So a framing question that Amichai posed to me, and I think has posed in this community, is, can our religious traditions help America engage with accountability towards repair and redemption? And we are going to circle around that question with three human beings of wisdom. And I think I'll just ask the three of you to introduce yourselves, and then we will get into it. Amichai, perhaps you are our host.
Thank you, Krista. What an honor and a pleasure to have you with us on this holy night. And not in audio, but in video. New for you and for us. So here's to new ways for all of us to celebrate the sacred ways and blaze new trails into the future we all need to walk. I'm Amichai Lau-Lavie. I'm the co-founder of Rabbi of Lab Shul in New York City. And on this holy night, I'm really honored to be in conversation with mentors and friends on one of the key questions for our time. And the question that has kept so many of us up for so many nights, and for the last 30, 40 days has kept our community asking the question, what does it mean to do shuvu, to get back to our best sense of self, to a higher sense of self as individuals and as a community? And tonight I'm hoping we will go deeper into this conversation ahead of this next year and many more years of holy work together. I'm so grateful that you all are here. And I want to invite my sister and teacher, Yavilah McCoy. Thank you for joining us tonight. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Yavilah McCoy, and I'm the CEO of Dimensions Educational Consulting, and I do the work daily of helping people to recover a deeper sense of their humanity in relationship. I believe deeply that our spiritual traditions can help bring us closer to a sense of atonement. And what I'm holding in regard to that question is what the word tshuva in Hebrew actually encompasses. There's the word shuv, which is to return, but there's also the word ba, which can mean also to come close. And when I look at that and I hold the sound of shuv, return, and the sound of ba, come close, I'm hearing Brian Stevenson in my ear talk about proximity and the way in which we can arrive at atonement in our nation by becoming more proximate to the suffering of others, becoming more proximate to the stories we've heard and not heard and we're not aware of in the context of this recent pandemic, global pandemic that we've been in. The stories we've been proximate to and not proximate to in terms of the suffering of our neighbors. More and more people are talking about what it means to navigate mental illness, what it means to be able to move through the world without health care. There are things that we have been close to, but maybe not proximate to. And so as I'm thinking about atonement, for me, I'm thinking about how can I return to familiar paths and see something different. See something that I've not seen before that calls me into deeper proximity. I'm also thinking about what it means to heal. For me, I'm looking at the idea that liberation is about healing. And in my work every day, I try to be healing to people who have been historically marginalized, people who have historically not experienced equity, and to do the work every day of turning the shirt inside out. You said turn. I had a teacher in seminary once who said to me that Shuvah is not about actually going to an old shirt that you've been wearing for years and that you don't want to take off because it brings you a lot of comfort, and saying, don't be that shirt to me. It's about taking that shirt and turning it into a pillow, taking that shirt and turning it into a turban, taking that same sense of comfort and turning it into something that is useful to you in service of dismantling oppression and bringing us closer to liberation. So atonement for me is about changing my old patterns in terms of the way I've been in relationship with racism, and making sure that I'm calling out for something new, something that calls me to be my better human self as a teacher, as a leader, and as an activist, and to hold the contrast between this quote, tzedek tzedek tirdo, justice, justice you shall pursue, and bishvili nivah ha'olam, for me and my work, this whole world has been created.
Thank you. Derrick, who are you?
Well, I'm the Reverend Dr. Derrick McQueen. I am the pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church in Harlem, New York. St. James Presbyterian Church is the daughter of the oldest African-American Presbyterian church in New York City, which is Shiloh Presbyterian Church, founded in 1822. And part of my story of Shuvu comes from having the need to identify what it is that we stand for now, almost 200 years later in this congregation. And I went back to the original purpose of the Shiloh Presbyterian Church, which was to be a haven for runaway slaves and for abolitionists to be able to bring those slaves to the North, not just to hide them out, but to give them a sense of community, a sense of faith, and a sense of spirit, to get used to their liberation and to be able to figure out how to be in community with those and how to allow that freedom to sort of become a new skin for them. So 200 years later, we started asking that question: where are the places in which we need to be liberated now? And in those spaces in which we need to be liberated, by returning to that question and returning to that home, we find that there are so many that are of need of having a community in which they can try on their new skins and try on their new ways of saying, I am ready to take off that for which I need to atone, and I am ready to try on something new, and I'm ready to move forward in something new. And to do that with an African-American congregation in a gentrifying neighborhood of Harlem has been a very powerful, powerful witness, because we identify the whole idea of gentrification is not so much a problem, but how do we address the issue? The issue is the erasure of the history and the erasure of the community that we give up when gentrification happens. But gentrification is more of a going back into saying, how was this community built? And what kinds of history is all of our history that we can embrace? So even though we are an African-American Presbyterian church, we invite everyone into our history, our American history, which is primarily an African-American history, but it's all of our history now, because we are returning to a place where we want to be in community and together. I also do a major work in canonical New Testament work and non-canonical New Testament work, which has led me to understand that Jesus was, as my 10-year-old friend used to say, a good little Jewish boy that she invited to her tea party with her Jewish grandparents. And that he's a good little Jewish boy, so why can't I have him over to tea? And it stunned everyone, because she gave me the language with which to study the New Testament, actually. This little girl, to go forth and to study this and to know that I had to go back to the context of the Jewish heritage of Jesus as a Jewish young man, and John the Baptist as a Jewish man, and Matthew and Mary, and all of these really holding on to the community rituals and the notions. And even then, that new movement of not Christianity, but of the way of those who are following this man named Christ, was not about something new, but it was about returning and cleansing and making sure that we get back to what is right and what we have agreed to in our covenant with God. When Jesus says, I come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, he's making a major critique about how far we've gotten away from the sensibility of holding one another accountable, of being with one another, and to care for one another, and that we need to return to that. That statement of Jesus alone, I come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, is a call of shuvu in and of itself. And I believe that it is my call to bring people back to that moment of saying, how far have we gone away from the very genesis of the idea that we are a caring people, a community of people, and that we are in this grand experiment of shunning what politics are, shunning what humanity wants us to be, and how can we grasp onto the aspirations of what our foremothers and forefathers and forebearers really wanted us to do in their most pure sense. And they died, my ancestors died, so that we would have a better opportunity to build that kind of a world by going back to those ideals. And then being involved in this particular High Holy Day season with Lab Shul has changed I call it a chiropractic soul adjustment. It really has made me sort of realign myself with so many deep, deep challenges that I've always had to come across in my religious life, but also in my life as an African American, and how my Aunt Dot called me to live my life when I was 5 and 6 years old. Lab Shul has brought me back to that. Has brought me back to those ideals that I used to talk with her about around the kitchen table on Friday night while she was making the apple pies for Sunday dinner and the sweet potato pies. And she and I would have these hour-long conversations about what was it like? What is it like to bring the best of your community together and to be? And how do we go back to that and always remember that? And I want us to be able to unearth what is there when we do go back, so that we can take it further into the aspirations of our ancestors, so that we can be the dreams that they spent their lives creating. That's where I come from in this conversation.
Thank you. There's much that's been said that we will touch on again, I hope, in this next time in front of us. I also appreciate the description of lineage. And I think it's worth noting that there's a great spectrum of Jewish lineage in this conversation. Yeah, Amichai, remind me how many generations of rabbis you descend from.
Well, the family myth talks about me being generation 39 on my father's side of rabbis.
Generation 39, and Yavilah, you are one of, I think, 4 generations of African American Jews. You grew up in an Orthodox community in Brooklyn.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So we have already moved into this, but I do want to dwell for just a moment before we proceed. You know, the rabbis say words make worlds. And I'd like to dwell a moment longer with this language that underpins the High Holy Days. Because it is this as a springboard for pondering the question of our life together in this country right now, and the contribution of the depths of our traditions to it, and specifically Jewish tradition. Amichai, I'm curious about how the word shuvu, shuvah, has been alive for you, perhaps come into a new light for you in this year of rupture.
Thank you, Krista. So every year when Lab Shul thinks a few months ahead of what is the main theme of this season of return for us, we, guided by marketing techniques, we come up with a theme, with a major brand. And in recent years, it was Aleinu, it's on us. And for this year, as pandemic deepened and we realized that we're going to be on screen for this season of connection in ways we could not imagine prior. And as more and more of us found ourselves on the streets and in these rooms, really galvanized around Black Lives Matter and around this moment of racial justice awakening and reckoning, the word shuvu kept coming back and back to me, and brought it to our team as the galvanizing principle. As Yavilah said, shuvu is this word that has so many layers. It is biblical. It is the biblical prophetic call to get back, to repent, to return, to get your act together. Shuvu in plural. It also has in it the Hebrew word shuv, again. And I would say one of my most helpful tools these past many months of being here at home alone in quarantine was tapping into meditation, both classic Vipassana that I've done many years ago, some new Jewish ways, whatever, non-denominational ways of just stopping and breathing. And again, shuvu, come back to breath, come back to breath, come back to breath. It's a deep practice, both for my spiritual inner work, but also for my political work on our need to get back. This will not be solved in a day. This is structural and systemic, and we got to get back in there, face it, and do it. And so for this year, the notion of shuvu as the collective call to return, it's a tricky word, but it's better than repent, because that's got such baggage, is one that I'm so moved has been resonant. And we have all these shuvu challenges going on of people taking the time to think, how do I get back on track in the middle of this crisis, in the middle of this moment of anxiety? Knowing that it's interconnected, and if how I breathe and how I center will enable me to listen to someone else, to notice what I'm not noticing, to lean into the proximity, and to commit myself to this work, not just for this high holy season, but as this being the jump start to deeper commitment.
I think something that I learned a long time ago, and I want you to tell me if I'm right about this, is that the word shuva, what is shuvu plural, and shuva is, or
Tshuva is the noun.
okay,
And it's a response to a question or an act of repentance. And shuvu is I'm bad with my grammar. It's like not the verb, it's the call to action.
Okay. And my understanding is that the Hebrew word, and Hebrew is a very visual language, there's nothing abstract about this. Right? I mean, you said repentance is a controversial word, but I think that might be because it doesn't necessarily have action attached, but the word itself is kinetic, it's practical, it's literally about stopping in your tracks and turning in a different direction. And I actually think that metanoia, the word in the Greek which is translated as repentance, has that same active quality to it.
I think, again, what's so interesting is that, again, the word shuv, again, is built into the word teshuvah. It's the understanding that we are constantly perfecting. This is an ongoing act of self-repair and an act of commitment to the cyclical movement. So you're so right. I'm hearing, and it's almost like I'm hearing the word for the way the wind blows. Aruach noshevet. So when the wind blows in Hebrew, it's the same sound. The wind keeps coming. This is ongoing. This is not just, and we're done.
Right. I wonder if if Yavilah or Derrick, if you want to just add anything to that that language piece. I think the proximate nuance was so important, such an important offering, Yavilah.
Yeah, I mean, my work is to always return to myself. I mean, there's a way in which I believe that I was born into the world human and meant to hold on to that humanity despite whatever oppressions I encountered over the course of my journey. So returning to my own essential humanity has been the work for me of dismantling oppression and dismantling the impacts of internalized racism on my Black woman's body. And as I do that, I find myself coming back to returning to the essence of creation itself. I mean, my belief system tells me that a Black woman gave birth to humanity. And you don't just have to believe me. If you go to the cradle of civilization in South Africa, it's been proven that Lucy, the oldest human form that we found on Earth, was an African woman. So when I ask people, what does it take to turn a human against its own mother? What does it take for a nation to turn on the source of creation itself through white supremacy and racism? I'm asking our nation to actually do the tshuva of returning and accepting us, accepting the beauty of our gift to creation as actually a gift, to turn and return to the source of who we actually are. And as I'm thinking about our nation, I mean, I want us to return to memory. I've said so often this past week, and I'm listening to Reverend Derrick talk about the history and the origins of that came through his church, that came through the lived experiences of people through the Underground Railroad. I'm holding for our nation, that our nation was born through the twin traumas of the genocide of Indigenous people and of slavery. And there are stories that are held within that. So returning to the beginning of our nation and retelling those stories as a fuller and more dimensional story so that we can address what is our national need for collective healing. If we don't engage in the shuv of tshuva, we are risking repeating a perpetual loop of reenacting those original harms, those original genocide and slavery violences that were perpetuated within our nation without discussion of the need for healing. So I want us to go back to tshuva, but I also want us to look at it and not take our eyes off of it until the balance of our humanity is restored. So the shuvu is super important to me. The fact that shuvu is in plural and command form is super important as I look at the language. Shuvu means do it now. It's and let's all do it together. So when we say now, I hear what I hear. You know, my family observes African and Sephardic traditions. So when we talk about we've sinned, everybody's dancing and singing. You would think we were talking about we were having a birthday party, but they sing Chatanu lefanecha rachem aleinu, and they almost demand when they say, we have sinned before you, now have mercy. So I look at the fact that we as a collective are not perfect. We as a collective are in process in this nation. But if we fail to hold the we that's fully dimensional about what we have to heal and restore and collectively do repentance for as a nation, we are doomed to repeat history itself. And so as I look at these times, I want to hold a we, I want to hold an urgency of now, I want to hold the creativity and gift of Black womanhood. And I want the gift of being able to be intersectional in my tshuva so that I can hold all of that from a space of the deepest core of my humanity. And that's what tshuva is for me.
That's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. And Yavilah and Amichai both remind me of the everyday application of this for me as a pastor. It's dawned on me during this season as my liturgical work each Sunday gets deeper and deeper. It has dawned on me that I write a prayer of confession, a communal prayer of confession every Sunday. And every time I do that, it is our communal return to atonement for all that we have done, for all that we've held. And it is not just so that we can have a moment where we say, okay, well, we have all made these mistakes, we're all human, we've all sinned, but it's also to relieve ourselves of that so that we can say, what healing are we calling for? Because the prayer of confession for me always ends up with an obeisance to say, but I'm asking for this particular healing. And then the great joy in the dancing that Yavilah was talking about, that becomes this assurance of pardon that I get to write, so that it is the celebration that because we have asked for that healing, we've gone back, we've done the atonement, and now we've asked for the healing. Let us listen to this assurance that it is coming, and that we have called it down, and that we are going to live into this. And then we sing. Rabbi Amichai has been involved in several of our services, so he's been able to sort of witness a little bit of that. And another one of those touchstone points between Yavilah and Amichai that I can speak to is that I also love the idea that we are always continually doing better. It's part of the reason why I'm a Presbyterian, because we are reformed and always reforming. And I take the ED out of it now. I said we are reformed and always reforming, because if you put the ED on it, it's heretical to actually doing something. So we are not reformed. We are reformed and constantly reforming, making new, becoming better. Grasping new ideas, being alive to the healing, to the moment of what's happening. And also the moment that I really cherish, that is the most helpful to me, that even when children don't show up in Sunday, is the adults make me do a conversation with young people. And I call it Let the Children Come, from Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, from Baby Sook's sermon. And the children and I sit and we have a conversation. And very often in that moment, there is an unweaving of the beginning of the acceptance of self-hatred, of oppression, of racism. There's an unweaving of that, and a hope that is reinstilled, that also, when the adults are listening, what they tell me is that it triggers them to remember and go back to that innocence that they had of hope. And it allows them as 85 years old and 92-year-olds to remember that hope and to live into that hope again, and to still claim my life matters. It is one of the most beautiful interactions of letting the young people be the ones who say, we are returning to this. This is to what we are returning, because this is the hope that will help us to heal and bring forth the change that we dream of. And it is such a beautiful intention, and I'm just always trying to create the liturgy to make that impact happen. And I love being in conversation with Yavilah and Amichai, because they lift up the understanding of that intention in such a powerful, beautiful way in terms of our shared experience as children of Abraham.
But I think that the theological notion of return, which is what you're describing and kind of spelling out also in practice, and how all this is embodied, it's quite different from what I think is in a time like this, which is extraordinary for people. So many people feel that the ground has come out from beneath their feet in so many ways. And there's a more, I don't want to use the word simplistic judgmentally, but there's a simpler notion of return, of going back to something, right? Of a return to normalcy. You'll hear that language, which I think, represents very human fear.
Yes.
But this return is actually calling us to something that we haven't quite lived into yet. And yet, which is more original, as you're saying. I don't know. Amichai, say this more beautifully than I'm saying it.
I'm not sure I'll try, but I think that's exactly the catch here, where language sometimes can become our friend and sometimes our trap. Where the word return, as we struggled about how we phrase this season, we don't want to use return. Return has too much of like, let's go make it great again thing. Like this is not about nostalgia. This is deeper than that. This is an archaeological dig into our prehistory and into our history, eyes wide open about, as Yavilah is talking about, the original source of who we are as a species. And the original concept of where religions have betrayed us because of patriarchy and binary and racist and misogynist and fear-based religiosity. I'll speak for Jews, but I know that our friends in various Christian worlds and Muslim and Buddhist and others are saying, wow, the kernel is so profound and the coverings have been poisoned with fear. So we want to return to the love, and the word return becomes tricky because we don't want it to be nostalgic. So we're being tricky with concepts like shuvu, which I hope is ingrained as you both said, as a command. And I want to throw another word into here, which I've been thinking a lot about, and many of us have in recent years and more in recent months, which is one of the words for Kippurim, for Yom Kippurim, that we are in, the Day of Atonement, the Day of Expiation, is reparation. The Day of Reparation. And I think I'll speak as an immigrant to this country, as a white man, as a father, as a rabbi, to deeply understand that the American atonement that is upon us is to deeply understand reparations as a collective teshuvah. And I'll say also as a son of a Holocaust survivor. And one of the reasons that my father, in his old age, he passed away 6 years ago, was taken care of as well as he was not just because of the Israeli medical system, but because of German reparations that were very debatable. But Germany in some way did teshuvah. Germany said, we're taking responsibility for this. And the money was, for individuals, was pittance, but it was symbolic and meaningful. So for me, teshuvah is not just words this year. It is a personal getting back to my not fear-based, but more trusting self, meditatively and otherwise, but more, and equally importantly, it's leaning into this work of teshuvah as a national call for reckoning, and I believe a process towards reparations.
What other texts and practices have been with you around that this year, or with you now?
Well, first of all, I'm just so full of the Spirit this evening, listening to both of you and how prophecy is leading to prophecy and what a gift that is whenever that happens. So thank you all for that. But as I'm thinking and listening with Rabbi Amichai and with Reverend Derrick, I'm just caught up by this idea of reset. Rather than talk about this as return, what has been reset in recent times so that we go back to a basic, to an equilibrium that allows us to have equal access to some truth is what's coming to me. And I just feel like in these recent times, yes, we've experienced fear and trauma and anxiety and lots of emotions that cause us to freeze. But in that stillness, sometimes in the dark is when you first see the stars. There's a way in which what we've been through has taken a veil off of our eyes and allowed us to see some things that maybe we weren't looking at or paying attention to before. And how do we lean into that? So for me, I'm hearing multiple phrases as we all speak tonight. I'm hearing the prophecy of the handmaiden at the Sea of Reeds. At the splitting of the Red Sea, they said that the prophecy of the handmaiden was equal to the prophecy of Moses. What kind of equality in terms of spirit did we experience at that moment of liberation that allowed everybody's eyes to be seeing the same thing in terms of the manifestation of God's beloved community? I'm hearing the phrase that we use in Torah, Bayom Hahu Yiyeh Hashem Echad U'Shemo Echad, and the way in which my father taught me when I was very young, that the idea of there being alignment between what we signify in language and what we actually experience in body, when those two things become aligned, that is a moment of prophecy. Hashem Echad U'Shemo Echad. And so there's a way in which this reset of equalizing power among us in this time is bringing us to a realization of what we teach in our Torah is the essence of freedom, is what happens when we experience the Jubilee. In the Jubilee, it's a reset. 7 different cycles of fallow, 7 different cycles of planting. And in the 49th year, we rest and we let that reset hit the land so that we can understand what's really true about our humanity, what's really true about where we come from. So I'm hearing reset tonight. I'm hearing this idea that when we talk about realizing beloved community with one another, it's about understanding, have we created barriers to prophecy and truth that the universe itself has now said, no more. Actually now, whether you are Moses or the handmaiden, you all can get corona. Whether you are Moses or the handmaiden, you all are going to experience what it means to have the need for change come through your community. Whether you are Moses or a handmaiden, you are going to understand that a fire can come through your country and make it so that soot and ash say that you can't breathe. There is so much prophecy right now out in the streets. And I think if we reset and allow our equilibrium to go back to basic, we can see some things that the universe is trying to tell us right now. And that's not about fear, that's about hope for me. So.
And I am I've been really stuck in the past year or so and really branding the idea of where hospitality comes from. Mm-hmm. You know, when I read in our text that, you know, Abraham and Sarah were, you know, these great hospitable people, and that there is so much thought and mythology around their grasp of just the whole idea of being hospitable to all of those wayward people who were coming in the desert and saying, I see you, come into my tent. I see you, come into my tent. It's like what that isolation carried for Sarah and Abraham was a need to reach out and to bring others in their moment of isolation in the wilderness and say, we are together. Let us come into my tent. Let us feed you. Let us celebrate together before you move back into isolation. That these are the moments in which hospitality is really holy community in which we find ourselves. And that is where the moment of this covenantal promise of the divine hit and was inspired, was in this moment of saying, I am reaching out of my isolation into your isolation, and I am bringing you into my home so that we can break this notion that we are meant to be together and to take care of one another. And that's where the divine promise stems from that fire, from that table. And I think that's what this return and reset for me is very much tied to the hospitality, the spiritual notion of hospitality, not the notion of saying, oh, you can come in my house, but if you stay for 3 days, you need to leave, or you've overstayed your welcome. But it is this moment in our isolation where we can re-identify and reclaim what hospitality really means spiritually, when we reach out to others from our isolation and to their isolation and say, let us come together, if only for a moment. This is what will help us to recognize that we are all in this same space together, whether you move on in your journey or not. This is where we have a touchstone to reset ourselves and to go forward in our journeys and to learn from one another what gifts we can now take on the next leg of our journey. And that's where I see where America has an opportunity, actually has a call and a demand on itself to stop all of this foolishness and to say we are in our isolation. Let us reach out to one another and be hospitable to one another. The hospitality of this country is gone. And some of the images that we're seeing in the media is gone from the language that we're hearing about how to treat one another who are oppressed, who are lifted up. It's gone. How do we return to that and reset that? And I believe that for me, that text is a seminal text for me in regards to that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just want to say about the text that as we're hearing, we talk about reset. So there's a technological aspect to that, just reset your technology. But I'm thinking about resetting the table.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the last 6 months, God knows that I've been cooking myself breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and insisting on the fine china, because who knows, don't save it. for the guests, 'cause they ain't coming anytime soon. But it's like every day, reset the table. It's like shuvu, come back. But it's about the way of resetting ourselves for the hospitality, even of spirits. And I just want to say one more text that has been really influential for me, surprisingly, these past months, is that back in February, a friend gave me Octavia Butler's books to read, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. And I found myself reading those all through quarantine. Just turns out those books are now on the New York Times bestseller, way, way after Butler has died. And who thought? She was the sci-fi Black visionary woman writer in the 90s who writes about the year 2024 as this American crisis and about a young woman who founds a new religion. And basically the idea of that religion is that God is change. And that everything that you change changes you. And that God is change. And I have to say, I'm thinking about Shuvu and change, and reading these books throughout these past months has been instrumental in what is prophecy and vision that isn't so much about the future telling, even though she nailed it, but about speaking truth to power and listening to those who speak it. And these days, that's not easy because there are so many smoke screens and so many misinformations. And yet I think our soul feels when we hear the call to change that comes from inside. And when we, like, all keep saying, okay, I hear it, I hear the words, now what's the next step? How do I walk this talk? That's really the big question for me.
I think also that question and the raising hospitality gets at what is distinctively challenging about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, these rituals, is that they, there's a personal searching, there's a personal reckoning, but it is also a public act. It has public implications and repercussions, and there's a calling that is about to the world to repair. As you all know, in our culture right now, there's a lot of blame going around. There's a lot of pointing the finger at what others are doing wrong. And there are dangerous extremes of that, which shouldn't be engaged. But then there's a much larger space where I think much more healing is possible than we give the people on the other side, whatever that other side is, credit. And I think that what I'm hearing you describe is the exacting but life-giving calling to name what is broken, what is dehumanizing, to name genocide in our history, and yet to lay a table to which others can come. That's what makes this conversation, this vocabulary of language and practice, a very distinctive contribution to our life together.
Makes me think about Psalm 23, Krista. You lay a table in front of me for all my foes to dine with. Complicated psalm with complicated translations, but this image of, right, those of us in this Zoom room right now, and presumably many of those who are watching us, will presume that we are preaching to the choir, that we're in the same room, that we watch the same news, that we believe the same polls, that we walk the same talk, more or less. That's a very generous and possibly flawed assumption. But what would it be like in this Zoom room and in other Zoom rooms and in sanctuaries across this country? We would be able to sit together around a table, real or virtual, and have these honest conversations of reckoning without blaming each other, but holding the blame together. I'll say that in the Jewish community, this doesn't happen very often for all sorts of things, and certainly for the amazing conversation that Yavilah and others have been leading us to talk about. Where are the Jews of color? Where are the other narratives here? Where is this big table and this big tent? And as we expand it, the work that Derrick and I have been doing in just expanding the notion of what's home spiritually. It's my prayer that we have more of these tables and we can be hospitable to each other's completely different opinions with an open heart. It's a tall order, but maybe the only command that's necessary for now.
I'll follow up on that and just continue with that psalm, Dishanta Bashem and Roshi Kosi Vivaya, that my head is anointed and my cup is full. There's a way in which there are already many tables. We just don't care to sit at them. We create hierarchies of value between which tables, be they in institutions or governments or wherever they are. These are the anointed tables, and those other tables, even though they're doing the good work of spirit just by being at the table, that's not what we value. So one of the things that I have deeply valued about Black Lives Matter is the way in which they've created a table at which all people can sit. They've done grassroots organizing and not said that the only places for us to do action are within institutions. Your action and your care for yourself and the universe and for this nation can be expressed in the street. And it's been equanimitous. And that's very different than the civil rights movement that we inherited, which did create hierarchies of value around gender and race and wealth that we still have lived into today as we're looking for what tables we get to sit at as we seek justice. So I want to go to that Kosi Revaya, my cup is full and overflowing. Because what I'm holding these days is that from the day I was born, I was valuable. If anybody tried to tell me otherwise, it was a lie. For every Jew of color to know that the table that they're already sitting at is the table that they were born to inhabit. For us to understand that every day we wake up with breath in our lungs is a gift. To recognize that every day we see another sunrise is another gift. For every day that we're able to move and enjoy the best and beauty of the water, the air, and the land, we are blessed. There's a way in which me waiting for institutions to meet me somewhere and invite me to a table is not going to give me enough to be able to sit at the table with my full humanity intact. I'm not waiting for anybody anymore. I'm already at the table. So there's a way in which I want us to also hold hierarchies of value that we've put on what does it mean to be able to sit at the table. Do you need a ticket to get to the table? Do you need a pass of some sort? Do you need somebody else's permission? Or are you able to accept that the tables that you sit at are already the anointed tables where your cup overflows, and to just revel in the deep, deep humanity of that? My mother used to say that, the goddess laughed on the day that I was born, and she said, that one's gonna be good. So in that image of spirit, creating beloved community by letting people come as they are, and to be at the tables they're already at, and to go visit those tables and sit with them and sing. We're about to come through Sukkot, which are, we have Yom Kippur to get through, but the celebration that you were talking about, Reverend Derrick, of knowing that we can ask and be received, yes, comes through a celebration at the next holiday. And in our tradition, we used to have in one community multiple different dwellings in which families would travel from one tabernacle to another tabernacle and just sit at each other's tables and sing. So to me, that's a vision that I'm holding of what it means to have one table. It's not really one table. It's that every table is worthy of sitting at and lending some joy and lending some spirit and hoping that those people understand that even after you leave. So,
in that conversation, I often speak of my Aunt Dot and my growing up in New Jersey. But I do remember one very poignant time when my Aunt Dot, she pulled aside a member of our family who was having some issues with substance abuse. And he had stolen something from her to sell while she was out of the house. And he came to the house on like a Thursday or Friday. Friday was chocolate day. Aunt Dot would bring you up into her bedroom, say, tell me about your week. And she'd give you a big piece of chocolate if it was a great week, a little bit of chocolate if you were bad, or none at all. but she stopped him at the door and she said, "You can't come in my house." She said, "You cannot come in my house because you stole from me. You've broken my trust." And she said, "And it's going to take a while to build that back." And I was sitting on the front porch, sort of listening, eavesdropping. And then she said to him, she said, "But Sunday dinner, this table is open for everyone, and I expect to see you here. I expect to see you on Sunday. You can't come in now, but I expect to see you Sunday because your family and your community, and then you will be here on Sunday when we are all together." And he was there. He was there, and it was just as, and he left, and he never came during the week until he sort of cleaned up and apologized. And that was the impetus for him to be able to, once again, reset, was that table of knowing that there is a space for me. There is a non-judgmental space for me. And we have families have all kinds of issues, but we were all around that Sunday table for that huge meal that we had. So this conversation of my cup runneth over and sitting at that table, even my enemies are around that table. There's that moment in time where it is a powerfully wonderful example of how do we be in conversation with those with whom we have disagreements, with those who we don't agree, but still say, your cup is running over. So I want to hear your story about your cup running over.
Yes.
So that I can take something from that. And we use that as an example in the Presbyterian Church when we were trying to open it up for the ordination of LGBTQ persons. We did this 1,001 conversations where we literally had one person who was for the argument call up another person who was against the argument somewhere in the country and just say, "How are you today? Tell me how you've been blessed today. Thanks a lot. Have a good day." And that was the year that the vote turned. It's just so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All of these stories and ways of living and seeing, which is really what this is about, are so important. And what they, I think, drive home is that this way of being in the world, living inside this tradition,
Yes.
it's not a different methodology, it's a reorientation, right? Which is, I guess, is a synonym for a reset.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
We just have a couple minutes that I feel like we went to some magnificent places. I've been struck by how the language of prophecy and the prophetic voice, the prophetic imagination has felt very natural to speak about. I just want to name that, put that on the table. I wonder if anybody would like to say more about what that sounds like in our world, where to look for that. But something else I want to pick up on. Amichai, you talked about the Octavia Butler novels and God is changed, and I would like to add. I know that Lab Shul is God optional, but something interesting to me in the world, which I've been noticing for years, is I feel like the language of God is resurfacing. It's a word that even people who don't believe in God we can't do without it. And so I would like to speak. I would like to just throw out this question to all of you about, an understanding of the relationship between God, whoever God is. Certainly that word is too small, but it's the word we have. The relationship between God and humanity, how this moment in our world brings that into focus with you, or the questions you're living with about it.
Ooh, that's for our next hour-long marathon. But briefly, I'll say that it is so clear to me that the building block, the master story of our tradition is that we are in divine image. And whatever the divine is, we are it, and this is it. All of us, all of this, beings, planet, cosmos, divine. The word God needs teshuvah. The concept God needs a rebranding and a resetting, because it is so baggage, and it comes from the monotheistic and other religions that have done so much damage to spirit. So you can say spiritual instead of religion, spirit instead of God, semantics. But
Yeah.
the deep concept of saying we are interconnected, we are one. Corona has, as Yavilah said, woken us up to this. And I feel personally that God Optional was our invitation for people to feel less threatened by the language and more invited into the concept of spirit, of being, of soul, of breath, of here, of now, of mystery. And to do this work of the reclamation of human dignity and agency, to become the anti-racists that we must become, to be the freedom fighters that we are called on, the spiritual call is at the heart of that. And if the word God or religious traditions are in the way, they must be revamped, revoked, or changed. And that's why even the Butler texts are so powerful, because they're so whimsical in this prophetic way of our moral imagination that demands for us to recapture the concepts and sometimes relinquish the language. And without that, I don't feel that we have the common ground to aspire.
On Sunday, in my sermon, I was speaking on some of the books, or some of the texts that I've worked with Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, who wrote so many wonderful books about the revolutionary Jesus. And it speaks to the call, especially in the Lord's Prayer when he analyzes it. And he says one of the most important things is the lesson of that entire prayer is not even so much the fact that it is the prayer that we've been taught how to say, but that it is the naming and the claiming that people's needs are holy, and that is what is lifted up, and give us this day our daily bread, that need is holy. And that is the divine call for all of us to lift up everyone else's needs as holy, and to be a part of that supply chain of saying, I see your needs and I call them as holy. And because they are holy, we will do our best to try and attain them. And that divine claim to that divine kind of language and promise, that's in my tradition, and in the Presbyterian tradition, and in the Baptist tradition in which I grew up, that's God. And it's a very Christian notion. And as I mature and I grow, I take that notion and also expand it and say, but this is our divine call. Our texts are to show, I believe, a major part of our texts are to show us the example of how we strive to do all that we can to see those needs as holy and to be a part of that change.
I guess I'll just weigh in at the end here and say that, for me, God is in the ability to see a thread of our humanity in all things, and to be able to see, like, what does it mean to see God in the cries of babies? What does it mean to see God in the groans of our elders in this time? What does it mean to be able to see God in the incarcerated, in the disenfranchised, in the refugee? It's not that God elevates them from what they are. It's that God doesn't need to be separate from those things in order for you to experience it as God. If those who have been marginalized in our world are God too, then what we can understand is that God takes many forms. And there's no hierarchy of value in regard to what God must mean. And when we understand that, then, excuse me, we start to hear God in our heartbeat. We start to hear God when we see people standing with one another that you wouldn't usually expect. We start to hear God when that shofar calls. Mm-hmm. And so I am looking forward to witnessing a sense of God and opening my heart. Sorry, just a second.
God is in that water, Yavilah. And in your throat.
God is in my water. And this little thing, it says power and equality. God is in power and equality too. But this idea that the wider open I can open my heart to create a tent for all people to dwell, the closer I get to an understanding of a compassionate God that has created all of these things and allowed them to thrive in their diversity in creation. So for me, reaching for God is reaching to see my humanity in all things and to see everyone's humanity in all ways in which I manifest and exist in the world. And that means making more room for freedom and making more room for today to be the day in which we get to have each other in beloved community.
Well, I want to thank Yavilah McCoy and Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie and Reverend Derrick McQueen for your prophetic presence, both in this conversation and in the world. And it's such an honor for me to be with you all, by which I mean everybody who comes into the Zoom room on this holiest of days. And I also leave very much having a sense that we all walk forward together, even though it is harder than ever before to literally do that. But we are doing that. So thank you and blessings.
May it be so.
Maybe so. Thank you so much, Krista. Thank you, friends. Gmar Tov and Shana Tova.
Ma Tov. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.